It was a quiet Friday afternoon, the sort of day where everything feels like it's moving in slow motion. The history class was dragging on, the teacher's voice a steady drone against the backdrop of whispering students. James tapped his pencil impatiently, exchanging glances with a few classmates who were as restless as he was. Just one more period, and it was freedom for the weekend. Suddenly, a harsh crackle pierced the silence as the loudspeaker sputtered to life. Everyone looked up in surprise. They never had announcements this late. But the voice that came through wasn't the cheerful principal's. It was cold and unfamiliar. "This is not a drill. Initiate immediate lockdown." The class froze, the announcement hanging heavy in the air. The teacher's face went pale as she snapped into action, turning off the lights and rushing the students to the back of the room. "Hurry," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. They huddled together in a hidden corner behind a row of desks. The playful mood dissolved, replaced by a rising dread. For the first few minutes, they sat in tense silence, hearing only the soft sounds of their own breathing. James felt his heart hammering in his chest. It was too quiet, too still. The hum of usual school noises, the cafeteria, the sound of doors opening and closing, even distant laughter, was gone. Then, a sound broke the silence. Faint footsteps echoing down the corridor. They were steady, methodical, like someone was searching each room. James clenched his fists, holding his breath. Beside him, Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, clutching her backpack as if it might shield her from whatever was coming. As the footsteps grew closer, a quiet sob escaped from a girl in the corner, quickly muffled by a friend. The teacher held up a trembling finger to her lips, mouthing, "Stay silent." The footsteps paused right outside their classroom door. A shadow darkened the thin strip of light at the bottom of the door, shifting as whoever it was lingered. And then, knock, 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 the sound echoed through the silent room. The knocking was slow and deliberate, each strike against the wood sending waves of panic through the students. The teacher motioned for everyone to remain calm, though her wide eyes betrayed her own terror. The knock came again, harder this time. And then a voice, so soft it was barely audible, whispered through the door, "Is someone in there?" The silence was suffocating, each student barely daring to breathe. James glanced at his friends, his mind racing, and saw his own fear reflected in their eyes. The voice on the other side of the door was chillingly calm, like it already knew the answer to its question. Minutes dragged by, and finally, the shadow shifted, moving away from the door. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. Just as they dared to hope it was over, they heard something else, a low, guttural sound that sent ice down their spines. It was breathing, heavy and raspy, as though someone were standing just beyond the door, waiting. The teacher, looking terrified, gestured for them to remain still. She slowly, cautiously peeked through a tiny crack in the blinds on the window beside the door. Her face went pale as she leaned back against the wall, her eyes wide. James swallowed hard, gripping Sarah's hand for reassurance. His mind raced with questions. Who was outside? Was it a stranger, someone dangerous? And why were they so intent on searching every classroom? The minutes crept by, each one feeling like an hour. The footsteps faded into the distance, but the silence that followed was somehow worse, filled with the ominous weight of the unknown. They sat there in silence, every creak of the building and rustle of clothing amplified tenfold in the stillness. Just when it felt like the nightmare might end, a noise shattered the quiet, a soft scraping sound, as if something sharp was being dragged across the walls outside. It moved down the corridor, closer and closer, until it stopped just outside their door again. There was another knock, slow and deliberate, each thud sending fresh waves of terror through the room. James could feel the panic rising, a silent scream building inside him. His heart pounded, his pulse roaring in his ears. But he didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, fading away into the depths of the school. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating, but they held on to it, clinging to the hope that it was finally over. An hour passed. The loudspeaker crackled back to life, the principal's voice announcing the end of the lockdown. No explanation was given, only a reassurance that they were now safe. The students filed out in silence, shaken and pale, glancing at each other with haunted eyes. As they left the school, James noticed something chilling. the faint, bloody handprint smeared across their classroom door. The classroom buzzed with whispers and laughter as the last few minutes of the school day ticked by. The students barely contained their excitement, ready to break free for the weekend. A few sat in their seats, scrolling through their phones, while others leaned over desks, chatting about weekend plans. Then, in a sudden burst of static, the loudspeaker came to life, crackling through the noise. Every head turned as a stern voice filled the room. "This is not a drill. Initiate immediate lockdown." The announcement stole the air from the room. Ms. Bennett, their usually calm and collected teacher, went pale. Her eyes darted to the windows, then to the students. She quickly turned off the lights, her fingers trembling as she gestured for everyone to get down and hide in the far corner. The blinds came down with a soft snap, and the usual warmth of the room dissolved into a dense, claustrophobic silence. In the dim, everyone squeezed close together, backs pressed to the wall, each of them holding their breath as if one wrong sound might summon whatever was lurking outside. The minutes crept by with agonizing slowness. They could almost hear the clocks ticking, each tick ratcheting up the tension. And then, breaking the silence like a hammer through glass, came the sound of a door creaking in the hallway. Everyone froze. A muffled gasp escaped one of the students, and Ms. Bennett shushed them with a silent, panicked gesture. A slow, deliberate footstep echoed through the hallway, followed by another and another. Each one was heavy, dragging, almost too loud in the otherwise empty school. The footsteps grew closer, the sound reverberating through the thin walls. A faint whisper slithered through the air, almost inhuman, just loud enough for them to hear but too faint to understand. It sounded unnatural, a breathy murmur that sent shivers through them all. Another creak outside. The footsteps stopped, and under the door, they could see a shadow. Something, or someone, was standing right outside. The silence in the room was absolute. Ms. Bennett held up her hand, urging everyone to stay as still as possible, to not make even the faintest sound. But then came a soft rattling as the doorknob twisted ever so slightly, as if whoever was outside was testing it, seeing if it was unlocked. Knock, knock. Two slow, deliberate knocks sent shockwaves of fear through the students. The shadow lingered, unmoving, just waiting. Then a voice, calm and chilling, whispered through the door, "Is anyone in there?" It was a voice they didn't recognize, a cold, calculated tone with an edge that hinted at something darker. No one dared breathe. The seconds stretched into minutes as they all stared at the door, praying that whoever, or whatever, was out there would just go away. Finally, the shadow moved away, and for a brief, fleeting moment, a wave of relief washed over them. But then a loud crash echoed down the hallway, a sound that rattled the walls and sent a jolt of terror through the room. A muffled cry followed, haunting and brief, as if someone had been grabbed or dragged. Some of the students dared to hope, wondering if it was help, but the look in Ms. Bennett's eyes said otherwise. She seemed just as terrified as they were. They didn't dare move, didn't dare even shift as they waited. The loudspeaker crackled to life once again, and every heart skipped a beat, bracing for what was to come. The clock ticked sluggishly in the dim classroom. It was the last period on a Friday afternoon, and everyone's mind was already outside, ready to escape into the weekend. Today, though, was different. Ms. Harper, a substitute with graying hair tied in a low bun and a quiet, almost wistful smile, had come to fill in for their usual teacher. She was soft-spoken and kind, yet something about her presence felt like a whisper of something much heavier. The students barely paid her any mind, except for the occasional quiet joke about how she hardly seemed to notice them. But then, the loudspeaker crackled to life. A voice came over, rigid with barely contained panic. "Attention, teachers and students. This is not a drill. We are in a lockdown. Please secure your rooms immediately." The words sank like stones in the classroom, stealing every trace of warmth and ease from the room. The students exchanged startled glances. Ms. Harper, who had been calmly grading papers, froze. Her hand trembled slightly, and her face turned pale as if she'd heard those words before, an expression that sent chills through anyone watching her closely. Why is she just staring at the door? Jason, a boy in the back row, whispered to his friend. But as if she'd heard, Ms. Harper turned, her face blank and unsettlingly calm. Without speaking, she rose from her seat, shut the door, and slowly clicked the lock. But instead of drawing the blinds and having the students hide, she stood back, eyes glued to the door, as though expecting someone, or something. Her hands shook, and she began pacing in front of the classroom. Her eyes darted to her watch every few seconds, lips moving slightly as if she were whispering to herself in another language, her expression growing ever more tense. It was a look none of them had ever seen on a teacher, a mixture of dread and resignation. Finally, Sophie, sitting closest to her, dared to ask, "Ms. Harper, are you okay?" Ms. Harper barely seemed to hear her. She only moved to the windows, drawing each blind with nervous, jerking motions, her eyes darting down the hall with every pull of the cord. Each blind closed brought a new shade of darkness into the room, suffocating the light and leaving the students stranded in a strange, dim glow. She muttered words that none of them understood but sounded like a chant or prayer, though in a language foreign to them. Jason couldn't help but whisper to Sophie, "She's acting so weird. Why isn't she hiding with us?" Ms. Harper's head snapped around, her gaze sharp and filled with an intensity that stopped him cold. She placed a finger to her lips, her eyes wide and silent. They held their breath, watching her, waiting for an explanation, some shred of normalcy to return. But instead, she simply turned back to the door, pressing her ear against it. She whispered something too softly for anyone to hear. It sounded like, "Not again." The silence stretched painfully until it was shattered by a sound, a faint, metallic scraping echoing down the hallway outside. The students froze. Jason, heart pounding, glanced at Sophie, whose face had gone ashen. Ms. Harper closed her eyes for a moment, as if bracing herself, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It looked ancient, with pages filled with strange symbols and faded ink scribbles. She traced her finger down the lines, whispering to herself as her eyes darkened. The students exchanged terrified glances, unsure whether they were safer inside with Ms. Harper or outside with whatever was making that sound. Jason couldn't keep quiet any longer. What is she reading? Why would a teacher carry something like that? Before anyone could answer, Ms. Harper snapped the notebook shut, her face pale. She held it close to her chest, her gaze fixed on the door as though it were about to break open. She turned to the class, voice shaky but resolute. "If they come in here, don't make a sound. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, stay quiet." The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. They heard it again. The scrape of metal, now louder, punctuated by slow, deliberate footsteps that seemed to echo through the hallway. Then came the rattling of the door handle. Ms. Harper stood her ground, positioning herself between the door and the students. She met their frightened gazes with a look of grim determination. "I've been through this before," she whispered, barely audible. "Trust me. Stay hidden." Time seemed to crawl as the footsteps stopped right outside the door. A single knock echoed through the classroom. The sound reverberated through every student's bones, chilling them to the core. Ms. Harper held up her hand, urging them all to stay still. Then, the knock came again, louder, more insistent. The students gripped their desks, barely daring to breathe. Jason shut his eyes, Sophie clutched her knees, and everyone seemed to melt into their seats, paralyzed with fear. Ms. Harper stared down the door, unblinking, unmovable. Just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped, followed by retreating footsteps. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible, wrapping the room in an eerie calm. Ms. Harper released a shaky breath, her face a mixture of relief and regret. She clutched the notebook to her chest as though it held every secret she wished to forget. After what felt like hours, she broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "There are things we're never meant to know. Shadows that never leave us." Jason, unable to contain himself, finally asked, "Ms. Harper, what was that?" She gave him a look filled with such sorrow that it almost made him regret asking. With a quiet, resigned tone, she answered, "Some of us are forced to remember." The hum of students filled the classroom as Mr. Lawson went on about the details of history, the same way he did every Tuesday during 7th period. Just as I began drifting off, a sharp crackling sound filled the air, pulling every eye to the loudspeaker on the wall. The principal's voice came through, urgent and unlike anything we'd ever heard before. "Attention all teachers and students," she announced. "We are going into lockdown immediately. This is not a drill." The room froze. My friends exchanged wide-eyed looks, the usual classroom chatter replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. Mr. Lawson moved quickly, his face pale as he shut off the lights, waved us towards the far corner, and locked the door with shaking hands. Just as we huddled together, someone behind me gasped. My gaze followed theirs to the front of the room, where words were scrawled across the chalkboard in a hurried, jagged hand. "Stay hidden. They're here." The message hadn't been there earlier. I glanced around at my classmates, their faces painted with fear, each one silently questioning the same thing. Who wrote that, and what exactly did it mean? Was it a prank left by someone before class? Or was this a warning meant just for us? My heart pounded as whispers passed between us, each one feeding into the growing fear. "Was that there before?" someone asked in a hushed voice. "Who would write something like that?" The room fell silent again, everyone's attention on the door as shadows flickered in the hallway outside. The sounds of hurried footsteps echoed down the halls, followed by an eerie quiet that only made our situation more terrifying. Jamie, who was crouched next to me, nudged my arm and pointed towards the windows. Faint markings smeared the walls, a trail of handprints, their smudged outlines like the warning tracks of something or someone that had passed by in a rush. Each mark was a reminder that we weren't alone, that maybe someone or something had been here even before we arrived. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. Distant noises grew louder, a door slamming shut, muffled voices, quick footsteps, and it felt like they were drawing closer, closing in. My stomach twisted as memories from last week came flooding back. There had been rumors among the students about a stranger lurking near the edge of school grounds. Most of us brushed it off as gossip, something that would vanish by the end of the week. But now I wondered, had those whispers been real? Had someone really been watching our school, waiting for the right moment to come inside? The seconds felt like hours as we sat there in the dark. Mr. Lawson tried to keep us calm, whispering reassurances, but his voice wavered with every word. "Stay quiet," he said, "and don't move. We'll be out of here soon." Just then, a looming shadow blocked the faint light under the door. The handle rattled softly, as if someone were testing it. The entire class stiffened, every breath held, afraid even to look in the direction of the door. My heart hammered, each beat a thud in my chest. I wanted to scream, to tell whoever was on the other side to go away, but terror held me still. And then, slowly, the handle began to turn. The words on the chalkboard, "Stay hidden. They're here," flashed through my mind, chilling me to the bone.